Hi, and thanks for watching another instructional video for CSCI 1300. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to store a series of values from a text file into a two-dimensional array. So we're going to be reading in information, and in this case it's going to be 2 rows of integers, and we have 10 values per row. So we need to store this into a 2 by 10 array of integers. And of course, because it's in a text file, we have it stored as string information, so we have to do some kind of conversion every time that we store this information. So how do we do that? Well, what we'd have to do is we'd have to set up file IO for doing this particular task. We're going to need the include string library and the fstream library. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to declare and initialize a string called file to the name of the text file that I want to parse. The next thing I'll do is I'll create an input file stream variable called inFile. InFile will then be assigned to open that particular text file called scores.txt here by passing in the variable for the file. I've got some helper variables here as well that I thought I would mention. I'm using a line and a temp variable. So every time that we go through the file, we're going to grab the information on the line. So line will contain all of the information at a time on a particular line, and temp will be used to basically parse that as we go along the line of information. I've declared some row and some column size, so we know that there are 2 rows of information or 2 lines of information in the file, and then on each one of these lines there is exactly 10 pieces of information. So we will have 2 rows and 10 columns. So we have a 2 by 10 integer array called scores, and I've gone ahead and set that to all the values being 0. So I've wiped the array. So after I've opened the file and I've got my helper variables and my destination for storage as initialized, declared, and everything, and what I want to do is I want to basically check to see if I open the file correctly, and also have a fail to open if it does not. But if it does open correctly, then I'm probably going to have some different variables. These would be like an I and a j variable for our array. So we have some row and some column, so we're going to associate k with the row and j with the column. And we're using k here because we're using a for loop to traverse across the line.length, so I'm using an I variable for the for loop. So instead of I, I'm using k for the row. So if the first thing I do is I check to make sure that there is no empty line. So imagine I have a text file where I have some weird spacing, and I want to make sure that I'm only grabbing information if there's actually information on the line. And what I can do is I can say that if the line isn't empty, then it's got value. And that means that we can do something with it. And the first thing I do is I'm going to make sure that at the top of every line, so every time I'm looking at a new line, I reset the j variable or the column to 0, because we will have to start over at a 0 position and keep adding into some column position once we update the row. So we're resetting j at the top, and then what we do is we basically add a separator character to the end of the line so that we can basically grab this last value. So as we go along here, we're basically saying as long as we haven't seen a separator character, keep adding this value up. Then you see a separator character and you know that you've got something that you can store. And once you store that information, you can move on and do the next one, right? The problem is when you get to the end of the row, you're going to actually have to need an additional character, the comma, to allow the code to recognize the last value on the line as being needed to store. Otherwise, this value, 84 and 36, will not get stored, and we'll have one less than we need in each particular row. So we add the extra separator character, and then we start traversing across the line of information. So we're using line.length because we are traversing across a string. This string contains all of the information on one particular line, and we're going to the length of it, which is the number of characters, no matter how big it is. So we're going to do this thing where we basically say if we haven't seen the separator character, the comma, then what we want to do is store the information up to that point into a temporary variable. So we would go along here and would say, is this 8 not a comma? Yes. Well, we haven't reached the comma, so we store 8 and 6 into temp, and then we move on and we see that there is a comma. So now we know that we need to actually store that information. So here, this would be we are at a comma, and we need to store the value so far that we have in temp. So how do we do that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to say that the array, the two-dimensional array scores of kj will be equal to whatever is at that temp string, and we're going to do a conversion on that temp string so that it becomes an integer. So here we have the value, say, of 86, and we go in here and we use stoy to convert that to an integer version of 86, and then store it into scores of kj. We then reset the temporary variable so that we can move on and grab 72, which would be the next piece of information after the comma. And we increase j by 1. So if we think about this as a two-dimensional array, we're starting at 0, 0. We add this into 0, 0. Then we move on and we're looking at 0, 1. So the j variable here is increasing as we go across left to right. So as we go this way, j increases. And then once we get to the end of the line, we'll have to start over at a 0 position for j, which is why we reset j at the top of the loop. So once we finish our for loop, we have traversed across the entire line of information. So we've gone across the string that holds all the values for that particular line in the file. After that occurs, we want to increase the row value. So that means that when we actually assign something new to our two-dimensional array, this will be at position 1, 0. So we've gone down to the 1 row instead of at the 0 row, and now we're adding at 1, 0, 1 through whatever n minus 1 we have. So just to recap here, we use a loop to go across all of the columns, all the column values of the array through the line. So we're assigning all of the column values in the for loop, and that's why j increases. The moment we're done with that for loop, we need to increase k while still inside of the loop that is handling the file stream, because we want to move down in our 2D array and start storing the next line of information. So this will allow us to grab all of the information from the file. And say we wanted to print this information after the fact, then what we would do is we would use a double for loop to print the information from scores of ij. And here we're just using an I and a j variable because they are scope specific. The I and the j up here no longer are relevant. They are scope specific to the loop that we had up there. So we can use I and j again here to print the information. And if we do that, what we can see here is that we get exactly the same information that we got from the file. So that's how we add in values to a two-dimensional array from a file stream. Thanks for watching. That's all I've got for now, and happy coding.